First, in real terms, the deflator is then superimposed on that to get the nominal values. So it's the other way around for at least 55%. So it is not as if nominal number of 8.8 is calculated, and because the deflator is 1% instead of 2 or 3%, we got an exaggerated 7.8%. That is not true. So there is real activity, economic activity, that is driving this momentum, and not just the price levels being on the lower side. And that brings me to the point I want to make, which is that post-COVID, India has been probably the only country in G20 to have grown at this rate for the last 4 years, from 21-22 until 24-25, and it continues. In fact, early indications for the second quarter, based on data we have for July and August, it seems that the growth numbers are looking up quite good even for the second quarter of July to September. In other words, it is possible that we may be underestimating the impact of all the structural reforms, topic of the session today. We may be underestimating the impact of all the structural reforms that have already unfolded under this government in the last 11 years. Whether it is the improvement in physical infrastructure, the advent of digital infrastructure, the various measures that have been taken over the years to move the small and medium enterprises from fragmentation to formalization, and also the ease of doing business, apart from the structural reforms such as the insolvency code, the goods and services tax, the Real Estate Regulation Act, the capitalization and consolidation of public sector banking, and of course the response to COVID, which was targeted, time-bound, and calibrated. Now you take all these together, there is a possibility, and I think we need to increasingly recognize the possibility that our domestic reforms may have already provided a kind of cushion that India would need in the coming years and decades, given the challenging geopolitical environment that may stay with us for quite some time to come. In other words, I think we may have already built in a certain resilience to global factors, the structural reforms that have been undertaken, and therefore we may be more positively surprised by growth outcomes than being negatively surprised by growth outcomes, regardless of the time and the path it takes for the current tariff uncertainties to dissipate, which I hope will dissipate sooner rather than later. So the first point I want to make is the structural reforms of the last 10 to 11 years are beginning to deliver in terms of growth outcomes and employment outcomes as well. The other silver linings we have in the economy, not only the recent GST rate reductions and process reforms, including on registrations, dispute settlement, ease of compliance, etc. This comes on top of the direct tax significant cuts which were announced in the February budget, the income tax bill simplification that got the assent of the Parliament, and this is the third one that has been undertaken this year. Because in many a situation, the ease of doing business issues and concerns predominantly center on tax authorities, tax processes, and tax compliance related issues. We know that the journey ahead is still very long when it comes to these matters, but what you see in terms of evidence from the government's determination is to address the tax related matters much more expeditiously than in many other areas, because they happen to constitute the most important touch point for businesses, both domestic and foreign. And we also got, very importantly, in the last few weeks, and that may have gotten a little bit buried under the avalanche of news and developments that are happening elsewhere, is a first credit rating upgrade in 30 years. We moved from BBB minus to BBB as per Standard & Poor. And if anything, if you look at the cost of borrowing for the government of India for a 10-year loan, Barely 11 years ago, we used to pay around 9%. The government of India used to be able to borrow at 9% rate per annum for 10 years. Now the yield is 6.4% for 10 years. And that is a reduction of about 2.6 percentage points on average. And not only that, the extra premium, the spread between the Indian 10-year and the United States 10-year has come down to around where we are today at 240 or 230 basis points, and the number used to be 600 basis points. Now, obviously, when the government of India's borrowing cost comes down, it is natural that other interest rates in the economy also decline commensurately, because the government of India's borrowing cost is the benchmark. And therefore, that is an important structural reform that is not very well appreciated, which is the ability to maintain fiscal prudence and fiscal stability amidst the challenge of the COVID pandemic, the security environment in the region, etc. The government of India promised to bring down the fiscal deficit from 9.2% to less than half in 5 years, and we delivered on it. And as the Honorable Finance Minister told us in the last few days, as she mentioned in the last few days, we will be able to deliver on the 4.4% fiscal deficit ratio this financial year as well. And that is a very important contribution that the government can make apart from many other structural reforms. It is to continue to stay on the path of fiscal stability and fiscal prudence, maintaining macroeconomic stability, and which is what provides the underlying foundation for economic activity to expand over the years in terms of voluntary exchange between the private sector players. Because at the end of the day, economic activity is largely driven by voluntary exchange between private sector participants, between the public and the businesses, and between businesses and businesses. The other important contribution that the government of India has made, although it might have attracted unwanted scrutiny from different players in the world, we have been able to deliver stable and low energy prices in the last 4 years, despite the turmoil going on in the world. And these low energy prices are also an important component of why our growth has been resilient and have tended to surprise on the positive side in the last 4 to 5 years. So these are the current silver linings that we need to remember: the tax reforms, the credit rating upgrade, and the low cost of capital, low and stable energy price, commitment to fiscal stability, etc., are the structural reforms that have already delivered. Now, in the next few minutes, I would like to dwell upon the structural reforms that we need to do going forward. What drives growth? In 2 simple words: competitiveness and innovation. These are the 2 things that drive economic growth in the long run. Because innovation is the bedrock of productivity, and competitiveness is the underlying ingredient for maintaining quality that will boost not only exports but also domestic production. So productivity is the key to competitiveness and innovation. And therefore, the importance of the structural reforms that the government of India is embarked on, and you might have seen this in the papers in the last 1 month or so, there are 2 groups of ministers looking at deregulation. There are 2 high-level committees, one focusing on deregulation and one focusing on Viksit Bharat under the former cabinet secretary. And under the current cabinet secretary, there are state-level deregulation reforms that are already being undertaken since the early part of 2025. Why is regulation very important in terms of driving growth prospects forward? Is ultimately we speak about it in terms of ease of doing business. The real motive or the real purpose is we need to reduce the cost of being honest. Regulation in India, rules, regulations, compliances, etc., have raised the cost of being honest, therefore prompting many businesses, micro, small, medium, and big, to take shortcuts in order to avoid and not to pay the cost of being honest. Therefore, the importance of the current momentum or the thrust on deregulation in the government, and it is not happening just in the wake of the tariff-related external uncertainties. It was a promise made in the budget itself in February 2025 that we will embark on deregulation both in the non-financial sector and in the financial sector. So in other words, these important structural reforms are about facilitating economic activity between people and to improve the ease of being honest. And that is the most important structural reform that the Government of India and governments around the country, including state governments, will be pursuing and will hope to deliver to the public in the coming years. And what is it that it takes on the part of the private sector to be able to complete its leg of structural reforms? I said productivity is the key to competitiveness, innovation, export growth, and sustaining long-term economic growth. That means that cost of primary and intermediate goods have to be reasonable and fair, and that doesn't burden downstream industries. Of course, you would point out that, yes, GST rates which are inverted and import duties which are inverted, in other words, higher duties on primary and intermediate goods and lower duties on finished goods, those are the components that need addressing on the part of the government. And in fact, in the GST reforms announced last week, those aspects are being addressed, and inverted duty structures on specific sectors, import duties have been addressed or have begun to be addressed in the last two budgets as well. But where the private sector comes in is large enterprises that operate in the upstream areas have to be mindful of their demands and preferences for protection, have to be mindful that those demands do not raise the cost of doing business for downstream industries, especially small and medium enterprises. Because protection is about maintaining your share of the economic activity. Productivity is about expanding the pie itself, is about expanding not just is about expanding the base, which is the underlying economic activity and economic growth. Whereas seeking to protect your market share keeps the pie from expanding as vigorously or as much as it could do so. So when we talk of structural reforms, one of the important structural reform that is needed on the part of the private sector is to reflect on the kind of tendency we have to ask and seek protection with a view to maintaining one's market share or expand, rather than seeking to expand the underlying pie of the economy itself. And even if our share remains stagnant or even goes down, because if the pie becomes much larger, the absolute take for everybody will increase. And that is a structural reform that the private sector has to contemplate on. Or a second best world is where the protection is necessary or desirable because of global context, because somebody is competing on many other grounds which are not necessarily fair and transparent, and therefore we need to protect our investments, our capacity, etc. The protection has to be in return for productivity. One of the reasons that Northeast Asia, in comparison to South Asia or Southeast Asia, one of the reasons Northeast Asia has moved from being third world to first world within a generation or two, starting from the 1960s, is that they allowed protection to large enterprises in return for productivity and performance and for external benchmarking. That is why you have Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, initially led by Japan, have a global presence and have global brand names than companies from Southeast Asia, for example. So in other words, where we seek protection, we also need to show and tell the public and the government that there is a skin in the game for those who seek protection, and that they will deliver productivity and commitment to quality, innovation, and being competitive in the global arena. And such protection, therefore, cannot be in perpetuity. And the protection has to be, therefore, defined, time-bound, and in return for productivity and export performance. That is the second important dimension of structural reform that we have to keep in mind on the part of the private sector. The next one, and I will stop with that, is because one can go on this topic for the whole day, and I'm sure that we will still not reach a conclusion. It is about the impact of technology, artificial intelligence, and balancing it with the need to create jobs in a demographically rich economy such as ours. We have estimated that 8 million jobs have to be created. You may think that I'm being inconsistent because in one breath I have spoken about productivity, and in the second breath I speak about importance of creating jobs and balancing the deployment of technology versus labor deployment. It is not. It is not inconsistency. Both are compatible, because ultimately what matters is the horizon over which we optimize our decisions. In the very short run, there is a trade-off between the two in terms of technology deployment and labor deployment. But in the medium run, there is no trade-off. And if we pursue one at the expense of the other, the benefits will not fructify, because for businesses to operate, it is not only important to have policy stability, fiscal or macro, etc., or monetary policy, but it's equally important to have social stability. And in a large country such as ours, with a huge demographic, young demographic profile, it is important to pay attention to social stability, not as an act of public interest, but as an act of enlightened self-interest on the part of businesses. And that is why being very mindful of how soon, how fast, and how much we use technology, not to displace labor, but to augment and facilitate labor productivity, is the other most challenging structural reform that the private sector has to keep in mind. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, what I would say is structural reforms are like a ballet, or it's a two-sided partnership. The government is very mindful, or even I would say the governments in the country are mindful of what they need to do. And I can assure you that the focus is on continuing to ensure that we make it easier for businesses, whether they are coming from overseas or homegrown, etc., are able to undertake economic activity without fear or favor. At the same time, structural reforms are a two-sided game, and it's important to keep the focus on productivity and expanding the pie and keeping the balance between technology and labor in a manner such that it is not socially disruptive. That is the structural reform dimension that the private sector has to be mindful about. I thank the AIMA, I thank Mrs. Sunita Reddy for giving me the opportunity to share my thoughts, and I wish you all a wonderful day of productive deliberations and discussion. Thank you very much.